Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Advocacy and Housing Trust Fund webinar. This is Laurel Birchfield with the Michigan Coalition Against Homelessness. And I have Jessica Akhmoudi with CEDAM on the webinar as well. And we're really excited that you can join us today to learn a little bit more about advocacy and the Lunch on the Lawn at the Building Michigan Communities Conference and also the Michigan Housing and Community Development Fund. So a couple housekeeping items before we really get into our content. We are using GoToWebinar, so for those of you who are familiar with this platform, this will be old news to you. But for anyone who is new, I just want to walk you through some of the items on your dash so you can kind of play along with us as we go through today. First of all, this is being recorded, so we will make this available for anyone who attended, or if you know somebody who would like to watch this but was unable to attend, we'll send that out shortly after today's webinar concludes so you can watch that. And it will be on Micah's YouTube channel, and I imagine CEDAM will broadcast it as well. We have everybody muted so that we don't have a lot of background noise, but if you have questions or comments, we absolutely welcome those. There is a question box at the bottom of your dash where you can just type in a question and it'll come to me and Jessica. Send it to us at any point. We'll answer questions along the way, and we'll also have time at the end to answer questions as well. We have allotted about an hour for this. Hopefully we won't take up the full time, so we do have plenty of time for questions, but send them in at any point during the webinar. And I think that'll do it for us. I'm going to have Jessica kind of talk for a minute about this webinar, and then we're going to do a quick poll to get some information from all of you guys.
All right, great. Thanks, Laurel. Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us. I'm Jessica Akhmoudi. I'm the Senior Policy Specialist at CEDAM, the Community Economic Development Association of Michigan. And today we are going to go over some of the basics of advocacy, talk a little bit about Lunch on the Lawn, and then also talk a little bit about the Housing and Community Development Fund. So I think, do you have a poll, Laurel?
Yes, I was on mute, sorry. Yep, we do. We'd like to know a little bit about your experience with advocacy. And I think the poll should be live. So just take a second, let us know kind of what your engagement has been in the past. Have you called, emailed, written your elected official at any level, local, state, or federal? Have you met personally with an elected official? Have you participated in something like a lobby or an advocacy day where you come into town and coordinate with a larger organization on specific talking points? Are you a newbie? Have you done any of this at all? Or is there some other kind of advocacy that we didn't think of that you've participated in? So Jessica, I do see that people are responding, and we've got a really even split here. This is kind of interesting. So I'm going to give it about another minute for people to respond and let us know. All right, I haven't seen anyone answer here in a couple seconds, so just about 5 more seconds. All right. So, looks like we've got a really even split between emailing, meeting personally, and participating in an advocacy day. About 56% of our folks have done one or all of these. About 20% haven't done any kind of advocacy. And then we've got 13% who are saying they've participated in something outside of these kind of parameters. So, Jessica, that gives us a really great sense of what everybody's engaged on. It looks like most of our folks have some level of advocacy experience. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, great. Thank you. Excuse me. So I guess I'm going to, since most of you, well, it sounds like most of you have some experience doing some advocacy, so I won't dwell too long on the things that we're talking about, but we'll cover a little bit the purpose of advocacy. So when you're advocating for an issue, you are first trying to educate and inform policymakers on the background of the issue. Oftentimes, the person you're advocating to has very little or only rudimentary knowledge of the issue that you're talking about. So in these cases, it's important to give them a little background information. You're also trying to affect change in some manner. You need to somehow motivate the person you are communicating with to help make the changes that you are asking for. Go ahead, next slide. Oh, do you want to, next slide, sorry.
Yeah, it might be a little delayed.
Got it.
I advanced. Is it
I'll
not
just keep
showing?
talking then.
All right.
So why should you, it's okay. So why should you get involved? I know everyone is very busy doing the on-the-ground work, and it may seem like you don't really have time for advocacy, or it's something that seems intimidating, or you just don't know much about it. But here's the thing. You are the expert in your work. You have the background, you know the impacts of your work, and you know the impacts and results of the policies that are out there right now. And lawmakers want to hear from their constituents. They can't be experts on everything, and especially with term limits nowadays, we know that's true. And if you establish a relationship with them and their staff, I can guarantee you that when a policy issue comes before them in housing or some form of community development or whatever area that you're working in, they're going to ask you for your input. Okay, so next slide. I just want to take a quick minute to go over the differences between advocacy and lobbying, because I feel there are a lot of misperceptions in the nonprofit world. And I'm not going to dive into this too deeply. There's tons of information out there if you want to look into it further. But most of the work that we do as nonprofits is not technically lobbying. As you can see, the strict definition of lobbying is trying to influence legislative or administrative action. So that means when you're talking to legislators, the only thing that is actually considered lobbying is asking them to vote a specific way on a bill, and that's considered direct lobbying, or a call to action asking others to contact their legislators about a specific piece of legislation. So that's considered grassroots lobbying. Most public policy work is actually not lobbying. So any kind of general education that you're doing, it's not lobbying. Voicing your organization's positions on issues or services you offer is also advocacy and not lobbying. And there's a few other things that are covered under the not lobbying category. That would be self-defense lobbying. So if there's a matter that affects your nonprofit's own tax status or your ability to exist, that's actually not considered lobbying. So nonpartisan analysis, study, and research. So if it's presented in an objective way, that's not considered lobbying. And communication with your organization's members on legislation, as long as there's no call to action. So if you're just talking about a specific bill to educate your members, that's just considered education. And also communication with members or staff of a legislative body. If you're just telling them, hey, this is us, this is the work we're doing, that's not considered lobbying either. Okay, you can go next. And then on the next slide, we'll have just kind of a quick look at the differences between state and federal lobbying. Again, I'm not going to dive into this too deep because honestly, that could be a whole separate webinar. But the Michigan Nonprofit Association has a great online booklet that really goes into this in more detail and talks about the thresholds and all that kind of stuff. But we won't talk about that today. We'll give you a link to that nonprofit book at the end of the webinar. And if you do lobby over a certain amount, you need to register with the state and federal government, but those thresholds are pretty high, and so what we're going to be doing next week, don't worry about that. Okay, so the next slide talks a little bit about what activities nonprofits can engage in. As I said before, nonprofits can lobby. You can lobby, but there are thresholds on the resources you can spend. You can also participate in voter education, as long as you're being nonpartisan about it. So you can explain ballot measures in a nonpartisan way, you can participate in voter registration activities, and you can and should be advocating for your particular organization's issues. Okay, and I think we're going to talk about lunch on the lawn, but I think there might be another poll really quickly.
There is, thank you. I am going to set up another poll for you guys. We're assuming that the majority of the folks are planning on attending BMCC and specifically the lunch on the lawn next week. But just let us know if you're still on the fence or if you're not going to be able to attend. So the question is just, will you be attending the lunch on the lawn next week? And we're going to give it about 30 seconds for people to kind of get back on their computers and respond to this poll. All right, I'm going to be closing it in about 5 seconds, so if you haven't responded yet, please take the chance to do so. So Jessica, it looks like the majority of folks are attending, just slightly over 50%. We have a small minority, 16% are saying no. And then there's quite a few, 30% saying they don't know yet. So it is our job to convince them, I guess. So why don't you talk to us about what Lunch on the Lawn is going to look like and what the opportunity is.
Okay, great. So this year, the Building Michigan Communities Conference really decided that they wanted to take much more of a policy focus. We haven't done that in the past few years, and the committee decided that was really important. So one of those activities that they thought would help would be Lunch on the Lawn. So what we have is we've rented tents. I believe there are heaters in them in case of inclement weather. But this is going to be a very informal lunch on the lawn. We've invited all the legislative offices to attend. We've done outreach a couple of times, and we'll be doing more outreach this week to the offices to try to get the legislators there. So this is just a really great chance for you to engage with your elected official in a really casual manner. We're going to, they wander in, they usually look for their constituents. So we are going to have the tents set up by region. You should have a color-coded thing on your name tag, and you'll see a color-coded flag in the tent, and if you go to that area, if any of your legislators come down, they'll be sent over there. So you'll be able to have a few minutes conversation with them, just kind of tell them about your organization, about what work you do, about where you're located in their district. And
sorry about that lag, Jessica. This is kind of the do's and don'ts section.
Oh, yes. So just a few things to keep in mind when you're meeting with your legislator. Just kind of like the do's and don'ts of general conversation and meetings with them. It always helps to look up maybe the bio and the picture of your legislator in advance. You can go to the Michigan House of Representatives and the Michigan Senate. Both have websites where you can just get a very brief overview of their bio, kind of figure out what they look like. It really helps when you're having a conversation with them. If you know some of the main interests that they have, it'll tell you, what organizations they belong to, what nonprofits they might interact with, but that's always good background information to have. You do want to know your purpose, so just introduce yourself, tell them what your organization does, and we're going to, a little bit later in this webinar, talk a little bit more about the Michigan Housing and Community Development Fund. We'll also have talking points available if that's something you want to talk to your legislators about. So you'll have that background information. You can tell stories and share data to illustrate your point. This one is always sometimes a little bit of a challenge depending on what district you're in. But even if you disagree with your legislator, there's a way to have a respectful conversation with them about it. I find that most legislators really want to hear from their constituents, and if you talk to them in a non-confrontational way, they're very willing to have that conversation with you about the work and what you do. Don't be intimidated. Ultimately, the legislators they do work for you. You hired them by voting for them, or they got elected and they work for you, and their job is to represent their constituents. And then I always find it's helpful if you do meet with them to send a follow-up thank you note. It reminds them of your organization and that they've talked to you before, and B, it's just nice to get that handwritten note. There are some really easy follow-up activities after you've made that initial contact with your legislator. You can send them your newsletters, your e-updates, your annual reports, anything like that. You can email their office, you can mail their office. They have staff that will definitely look through those, and it's just a great way to get your name in front of them on a regular basis. Most legislators also have in-district meetings and coffee hours. You should be able to find those online, and that's a really easy way to get access to your legislators. And then I think a really important thing is invite them to your events or to your facility to see your work. Like I said before, legislators really like connecting with their constituents, and they are at home in the district Mondays and Fridays of every week. Tuesday, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, a lot of the time they're in session, but Mondays and Fridays, they are home in the district. Those are great days to invite them to a luncheon, or maybe if you have a ribbon cutting, or just to visit your facility to see what kind of work you're doing.
Thanks, Jessica. I'm going to ask us to kind of pause for a second and see if anybody has any questions. I think Jessica's laid out for us some really great information about advocacy in general, and also kind of what to anticipate next Tuesday with Lunch on the Lawn. So our next piece is going to be to get into the details a little bit more about the Housing and Community Development Fund. Before we do that, though, if you have any questions for Jessica, please use that question box, send them in to us. We can answer them as we go along, or we can kind of circle back at the end of the presentation. But lots of good information for us to process. And depending on your comfort level with advocacy, this may be kind of repeat for you, maybe some information you've already had access to, or maybe fairly new. So thanks, Jessica, for sharing all of that and kind of setting up the Lunch on the Lawn. Hopefully we've convinced some of those I don't knows to attend now.
Thanks, Laurel. I would also like to point out, I don't think I said this, the Lunch on the Lawn, you're probably not going to get a ton of time with your legislator, so it's more of enough time to introduce yourself, your organization, and the work you do. If you're interested in advocating a little further and talking about more specific programs, I really suggest that you try to get a meeting with their office. And even if you don't meet with a legislator, if you meet with their staff, that's still a really great, it's important to meet with our staff too.
Absolutely. And Jessica, this may be putting you on the spot, but do you know, is that the only lunch option for next Tuesday?
It is the only lunch option that the conference is providing, yes.
Even more reason to attend. All right, so not seeing any questions coming in, I'm going to go ahead and move forward with some more specific talking points about the Housing and Community Development Fund. So the Housing and Community Development Fund is something that serves a very important need in our state. So in Michigan, for every 100 extremely low-income renters, there's only 37 affordable and available units. And this is from a national study from the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. This is obviously focused on renters, but I think it really encapsulates the growing affordable housing crisis that we're facing here in Michigan. We definitely do not have enough, and this is mostly across the board around our state, depending on if you come from an urban or a rural community, from up north or here, or more in the center or southern part of the state. We don't have enough housing and enough rental units available for everybody who is a low-income household who needs access to some of those more affordable units. And so we definitely are facing a need here in Michigan that we need to start thinking about and planning for. And so we really want to use this opportunity at BMCC and beyond to be able to start talking about that in a way that encourages our legislators to be proactive and to be thoughtful about how we're investing in our future with housing. So the housing trust funds are a growing trend nationally. They're sources of funding for construction, acquisition, preservation of affordable housing. And we have 47 states that currently have some form of a housing trust fund. Of those 47 states, 30 have a permanent source of funding, and 24 use some kind of document filing fee in order to have a permanent source of funding, and which means that this fund always annually has money coming in that can be utilized through whatever source, whatever agency governs that fund in those states. Those 24 that use some kind of document filing fee typically use like a real estate transfer tax or a document stamp tax. So here's just a visual for you. The red indicates those states, the red and the blue are states that have a housing trust fund. The red indicates those that have the ongoing dedicated funding source. The blue has no dedicated funding source. As you can see, Michigan's a little island there in the sea of the Midwest of red, meaning that we are one of the few Midwest states that does not have an ongoing dedicated funding source for our housing fund, which means Michigan is falling behind in terms of being able to have a pool of money that we can regularly use for this need. So let's talk a little bit more specifically about our Housing and Community Development Fund. This is a fund to support the coordination of private and public resources and focused specifically on affordable housing and vibrant communities. So these funds programs that revitalize neighborhoods and downtown areas, and it's administered by MSHDA. It was passed by legislation back in 2004. This was from a huge coalition effort of dozens of organizations, of which CEDAM was the lead and Micah participated. It was a very long process to get legislators who were interested in starting that up, but they were ultimately successful back in 2004 in getting that legislation passed, which is a huge victory because it means we're one of those states now that has a fund and has the infrastructure for being able to bring in funding and allocate it to these projects that are going to help low-income households in our state. That's the good news. The bad news is that since it was initiated, this fund has only received funding twice. The first was back in 2008. It received approximately $2.2 million, and that was from the general fund appropriations process. Then it wasn't funded again until 2012. This was a slightly larger amount of money, $3.7 million, and it was allocated from the National Mortgage Settlement. So that means since 2012, we have not had any money come in to the Michigan Housing and Community Development Fund. Now, this is not to be confused with the National Housing Trust Fund, which MSHDA also oversees. That is a federal program. We're talking very specifically about the State Housing, Community, and Development Fund, and that hasn't received funding for over 8 years now. So to give you a sense of what the Housing and Community Development Fund can do, let's dig a little deeper into the 2008 and give you a little snapshot of what it was able to do. So with that, slightly more than $2 million, the process was that MSHDA funded certain programs based on some very specific criteria that they had. And this resulted in 9 Habitat for Humanity projects around the state. It resulted in 16 units of permanent supportive housing. I believe that was in 2 different projects, so 2 different areas of the state. It funded a program that provided security deposits for precariously housed persons. It also provided programming for homeless or at-risk households, so some of our most vulnerable folks. It developed mixed-use affordable housing. I believe that was in Detroit. And also a project that built energy-efficient senior housing. So you can already see by looking at these types of projects that it really did focus on some of those most vulnerable, low-income, housing insecure or homeless individuals. It served over 130 low-income households and prevented homelessness for 78 households. These are the kind of projects that we absolutely need funding for, and we need to be able to have that ongoing support for programs and projects that really support these kinds of initiatives. And I think that that is it for my notes about the Housing and Community Development Fund. Really just kind of wanted to give you guys some basic points just because, as Jessica said, there's not going to be a lot of time at the Lunch on the Lawn. There's going to be just a couple minutes for you to interact with either that legislator or that staff member. It's really your opportunity to introduce yourself, introduce your organization, and then bring some of these talking points forward. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't continue these conversations, and we hope that you will. This is going to be a long statewide effort to try and get this permanent funding source for the Housing and Community Development Fund. And that means that we're all going to be working on this beyond just the Lunch on the Lawn. But we also know that working with legislators, it takes quite a few touches before you really make an impact. And so this is going to be one of the first times, probably, that these legislators are going to interact with someone who's bringing forward these ideas and this concern. So hopefully we can make an impact and then move forward and continue having these conversations at some of those in-district engagements that Jessica suggested, or at future opportunities for you to come to Lansing and talk about this further. So on the screen are just some resources for you guys. There's some things that Jessica referenced and just some items for you to dig a little deeper if you have more specific questions about how you can advocate or lobby in the state of Michigan. And then the last two, we have 2 different policy committees that you can participate in. Just always like to let you know about those. So the CEDAM Policy Committee, you can contact Jessica, and her email address is on there. And then Micah also has a Legislative Action Committee that meets once a month. You can contact me if that's anything that you're interested in and want to participate in. I think both of our committees moving forward are going to be talking about this issue with the Housing and Community Development Fund. I would encourage anyone to get involved with that. Jessica, do you have anything that you want to add at this time?
I don't think I do, but I do encourage if anyone wants to get involved in either of our policy committees to please let us know. We're always welcoming new members. I have a policy committee meeting tomorrow, actually. So.
Great. We just had ours today. So I think that was all that we wanted to chat about with you guys. We walked through it pretty quickly, given your guys' experience with advocacy. We didn't want to bog you down with the details on that. And then with the Housing and Community Development Fund, just kind of wanted to give you the basics so that you felt comfortable and confident to go into this lunch on the lawn. I don't think that we've had any questions come in.
Okay. No question.
Looks like our group is already feeling pretty confident with this. We'll stay on for a couple more minutes in case you have questions. But Jessica, is there anything else that you want to add here at the end, since we kind of sped through some of this material?
I don't think so. Just if any questions pop up before the conference next week, feel free to email either one of us. Or even after that, you know, I think we're both always here to answer any kind of advocacy questions that anyone may have.
All right, looks like we got a question asking if we're going to be sending out the slides. Yes, we can absolutely do that. And as I said, this has been recorded, so we'll send it out with the link to the recording too. All right. I'm not seeing any other questions. Oh, spoke too soon?
Talking points, are those going to get sent out as well?
So we're also, yes, we will make sure that you guys have that information in advance so that you are able to kind of take something with you for the lunch on the lawn, so you can have that at hand, and we'll get that out in advance of next week. And that's also the kind of thing, go ahead.
Go ahead. Oh, I was going to say we're also trying to get handouts at the registration table, so if anyone wants to grab those during the conference, those should be available too.
All right, Jessica, we did get another question. Where would the funding come from for the Housing Trust Fund? That is an excellent question, and one that we are purposely not putting out there because we're still trying to identify the source that makes the most sense for our state. Jessica, do you want to comment on that?
No, I think that's correct. We're really looking for a long-term sustainable funding source. You know, general fund is too easy to cut and fill holes with when that happens. So I think we're probably, you know, we're just looking at what do other states do. We talked about the document recording fees or the real estate transfer tax seem to be the most common ways that people fund these funds. And we're still doing the background research on that to see if that looks feasible in the state.
I think we're also doing some important conversations with the most important parties that would come to the table on this, and making sure that we're putting forward a solution that makes sense for Michigan, and that people can all kind of rally behind and support. The last thing we want to do is be putting out ideas that the legislature will not support and that will not provide enough funding moving forward, because that's another key, is we want to make sure that we have enough funding in whatever source we identify. But thank you for the question.
Yeah, I agree. And also, I mean, at this point in time, I just think it's really important to be having a conversation to educate the legislators on housing trust funds, and that we have this in Michigan. It's just not funded. Yeah,
I will say, so Micah held an advocacy day last week where we brought this forward with the legislators that we met with. And I get the sense that a lot of our new legislators in particular, remember we just had an election, and so the entire legislature started over this past year with quite a few new members. A lot of those new members did not know about this. Several of the older members did not know about this. And so educating them that it even exists is absolutely the first step. All right. I don't see any other questions coming in. I think it's safe for us to go ahead and wind down, but if you think of something later, please absolutely, as Jessica said, reach out to one of us, and hopefully we'll see you all on Tuesday on the Capitol lawn. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you.
Have a good afternoon.